Welcome to the Color of Success podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie J. Wong. Many of us are feeling a wide range of emotions: sadness, anger, fear, sometimes hopelessness and helplessness. This season, we will be exploring all the feelings and ways to empower each other to take action. So, let's go. Game on. One of Time Magazine's 2021 Next Generation Leaders and named on McLean's Power 50 list in 2022, Dr. Chika Stacy Oriuwa is a medical trailblazer spearheading change in healthcare and beyond. Currently a resident doctor in psychiatry at the University of Toronto, Dr. Oriuwa is a graduate of the school's Temerity Faculty of Medicine and has served a variety of board positions. Dr. Oriuwa was also honored in Mattel's #ThankYouHeroes campaign with a one-of-a-kind Barbie doll made in her image to commemorate her contributions as a frontline healthcare worker. Recently, Dr. Oriuwa established the Dr. Chika Oriuwa Award for the advancement of Black health at Temerity Medicine, which will be awarded annually to a graduating medical student. She recently published her memoir, Unlike the Rest, and you can purchase it now. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this show. I'm so excited for this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, let's jump right in. Can you tell me a little bit about your background that inspired you to become a doctor and how it's kind of informed your practice today?
Absolutely. So I'm a Nigerian Canadian woman, second generation. So my parents came from Nigeria to Canada in the 1980s. They actually came separately and met in Montreal, and then
Oh,
had myself and my three siblings. So there's four of us in total.
wow.
I know. Big family by North American standards, but small family by Nigerian standards.
Yes.
Um, right? And so I grew up in a suburb outside of Toronto known as Brampton. And growing up, I always had this long held fascination bordering on obsession with human anatomy, how the body functions, how it malfunctions. And my parents said that I was 3 years old when I stated that I wanted to be a doctor. Now, at three, I didn't quite have the conceptualization of what medicine actually was. And so I didn't understand what it was like to be up all night or to have extremely or early mornings, late nights, what it felt like to be in an OR and help deliver a baby, or what it was like to hold a patient's hand in palliative care as they take their last breath. I had no real concept of any of these things. All I knew was that my uncle, my mom's brother, was a neonatologist in the US. And in my 3-year-old mind, I distilled that down to meaning that he spent his entire day taking care of babies. Now,
Yeah.
I was obsessed with babies then, clearly still obsessed with babies now. And so I just decided that that's what I was going to do with my life, was to become a doctor. Now I consider myself very fortunate such that my academic interests and pursuits aligned very much with what would have prepared me to become an astute physician. And so I loved math, loved biology, loved all the sciences, loved everything to do with that. But I also really loved English and writing and the arts. And now someone might think like, what does that necessarily have to do with, being a physician, or, that might be better suited to being a lawyer. But I absolutely believe that my early linguistic talents, and as someone who wrote poetry from a very young age, did professional spoken word poetry for a very long time, that this still prepared me, if not more than my scientific interests, for becoming a doctor, because it taught me to critically evaluate the world. It taught me the power of transcendent human connection. And it ultimately heavily informed my decision to go into psychiatry, which I felt most like an artist within the medical world. And so I that is a little bit about my background as to, who I am and what led me into medicine.
Really treating patients, especially in the mental health field, it is a science and an art. And I think writing and critically thinking and case conceptualization are wonderful. There's no one size fits all approach when you
Yes.
sit down with somebody, for sure.
Absolutely.
So I read that you actually would play with toys to kind of do this imaginative play, and you were also memorialized as a Barbie, one of a kind. And so, what was it like to kind of reflect on your past experiences and then having this honor?
So, I mean, as you mentioned, I grew up playing with Barbies, and I loved as a little girl pretending that my Barbies were doctors and pretending especially that they were Black female doctors, because that for me was a way that I could imagine what was possible, especially since I didn't necessarily have any Black female doctors in my immediate community that I could look to in the flesh. And so the only options I really had, especially as I, was entering my adolescence, was watching Grey's Anatomy and seeing Dr. Miranda Bailey and being like, oh, there's a Black female doctor. Like, this is incredible.
Yes. And she's
Um,
amazing.
and she's amazing and like a total, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear, but I was gonna say
Oh,
badass.
yeah.
She's a total badass. And so I really, really aspired towards her, but definitely playing with Barbie dolls. And then having had the opportunity, which is still a surreal, I can't believe it happened, opportunity where I was able to have a Barbie made in my likeness, and having that one full 360 moment where it's like, oh my goodness, like this was something that I dreamed of as a child, and now I actually get to have my own Barbie that looks like me and is the Black female Barbie I wish I could have played with as a little girl. And like, I obviously can't give it to my younger self, but I can give it to my daughter, I could give it to my son, and they can, while they're sparking their imaginative play, then for them not only is it imagination, but it's real, it's concrete. Like they know that this is a reality. They can turn and look at their mom and be like, you're a doctor, not just my Barbie, but you actually. And like that completely changes their frame of reference as to what's possible for them in the world.
Absolutely. And the representation and being able to see yourself, like literally and figuratively, in this Barbie, and having your kids see that is one of those things that are just, I would get speechless. I am speechless because it's such a huge thing. I mean, the Barbies that I had, I was super excited to have an Asian Barbie doll, but it was like a special collector edition, right? And like, I think she was so gorgeous, but most of the Barbies were white and had the Malibu dream house and things like that. And not to say that women of color don't want that or can't have that, but
Right.
it's different. The cultural aspect of actually seeing yourself is very, very heartwarming and progressive. I can say that because the world is a little upside down right now. Um,
Very much so. And on the note of like when Barbie did start to introduce a more diverse line, I remember when they brought out the first Black Barbie, and I believe I was, still a child, or, I don't know the exact dates, but I remember the first time I saw one and thinking, they have a Black Barbie, but her hair was exactly like the white Barbie. Like it was
mhm,
pin straight, her features, like she was essentially just the white Barbie with darker skin.
mhm.
And I was like, I remember even as a child thinking, okay, so I would only be beautiful if my hair was straight, if my nose was thin, if my lips were thinner, and if I essentially am just a black version of a white woman. And then that also made me feel like, okay, well, if that's society's version of beautiful, then this is what I need to aspire to. And so in ways, even the original introduction of diversity into the Barbie line had its own problematic like tinge to it. And I think that they've come a very far way, like
Yes.
huge, huge, huge way. And so I'm honored to have been a part of that experience, but definitely as a little girl, it was very confusing. The messaging was very confusing.
And it still is, honestly. Like,
And it still is,
we
yeah.
have come very far in terms of the toys and people kind of understanding that a little bit better. But I think, this idea of what we as women of color need to do to be and fit into this beauty standard is just, it
Yeah.
continues to expand and in many ways ridiculous ways. But there's a lot of challenges, some real challenges that you faced when you got into med school. And I remember when I got into graduate school, I was like, so on top of the world. I could do anything. I'm ready to do anything, that eagerness that happens. And similarly, when I got to school, there wasn't as much diversity reflected in the staff. But you had an interesting experience. So, can you talk about the barriers that you faced in school and in your career?
Yes, so I did have an interesting experience such that I was the only Black medical student in my cohort in the class of 2020, but we started in 2016 at the University of Toronto. And Toronto is one of the most culturally diverse cities in the world. And I believe at one
Yes.
point was the most culturally diverse city in the world. And so to have been at such a cultural epicenter and multicultural epicenter and to have been the only Black individual in my class was jarring, especially since I had specifically chosen this medical school out of the medical schools that I had gotten into. Had specifically chosen it because it was the only one that had a Black Medical Students Association. And so I went in there with the idea that things would look a little different, I guess you could say. And this was also on the backdrop of having just finished my undergraduate degree at McMaster University in health sciences, where I was the only Black student in my class, and then wanting to have a departure from that narrative, and then finding myself instead of a departure, it was a continuation, and that in and of itself was a little bit disheartening. And the next 4 years unfolded such that and I write about this in my memoir, unlike the rest of Doctor Story, how there I had to confront a lot of racism, sexism. I was asked in my early years, or in my early months of medical school, the first year, to be a public ambassador for the Black Student Application Program. And I had initially turned down the opportunity after speaking with quite a few mentors and friends who said that it would be tokenizing. I would be putting a target on my back, that the institution will, penalize me in covert and maybe in ways that I could see, in ways that I couldn't see. And so I initially turned it down, but then within 24 hours, I decided to go back and do it because I felt like it was important for me to advocate for the Black Student Application Program, which aimed to increase the number of Black medical students at the institution.
And there's a sense of bravery and courageousness in doing that because really you're putting yourself out there, right, for criticism. And there's this visibility there that can be very uncomfortable, but the mission is very consistent with your values. Um,
Mhm.
Talk to me more about what it was like to be the only, I mean, that's
Mhm.
always really difficult to
Yeah,
be in those spaces.
it was very hard. It was very challenging. On my first day of medical school, I was asked if they made it easier for me to get into medical school. One of my peers had asked me that in my medical school class. And that was really, really challenging to have to confront that from the outset, like literally the very first day of medical school. And then for me, what I found particularly devastating was that I went in there with the anticipation of having that inherent solidarity with other Black medical students, and that even if we weren't going to be the best of friends, because I think that it requires more than just having a shared racial identity to be
Yeah.
best friends with someone, but that there would at least be other individuals who I would be able to have a sanity check with, I guess. And, being able to, and I wrote about this in my book, sometimes it's as simple as like that shared glance, in the same way that if there were two women in a room full of men and they start talking about something that has sexist undertones, maybe even if I'm not best friends with that other female colleague, there's a good chance that I would be able to look at her and she could look at me and we can exchange that knowingness that, oh, did you
The
catch that?
internal eye roll. is what
Yes,
I like to call it.
yes, the internal eye roll
Yeah.
towards the patriarchy. Like it is that kind of like, okay, I see you. And I think when I put it into those terms of um being the only woman in a room, I feel that other women, white or otherwise, it's like an aha moment of like, oh yeah, many women can relate to that idea of like, being the only woman in like a business setting or things of that nature and how they remember it feeling. And then it's like, okay, now take that perspective and extrapolate it to that being very similar, not the same, but very similar to being the only Black person in a room. And now we know that race doesn't exist on a binary. It's not like you're either Black or white. I
Mhm.
recognize that there's a lot in between. It's a very complicated system, but certainly when you are the only Black person and everyone else is non-Black, and there's a predominant whiteness in the class, um, it's it's definitely an incredibly othering and isolating experience. And, that being said, I was still able to forge friendships. I wrote about the friendships that I had in medical school that were incredibly protective, incredibly wholesome and genuine and wonderful, and got me through medical school. And I also feel like I got them through medical school as well. And I wrote about how, certain groups would try to take me into their fold. And what was interesting about my med school, and I don't know if other medical schools are like this, but what was interesting about my medical school was that it felt like there was a lot of clear groups that were almost drawn by like cultural lines. So a lot of, I guess, yeah, I guess it's pretty self-explanatory. There are a lot of like groups that bound people together through cultural lines, which is understandable because you can identify more with someone when you come from the same culture, and like it's not rocket science. And of course, there was a bit of admixture, but generally speaking, that's what I noticed a lot. And because of that, I like organically fell to the side. And yet there were some girls who would like, try and bring me into their group and whatever. But then when I would hang out with them, it was just the cultural differences were just so stark. Like, even just having a basic conversation about like what you're doing on the weekend or what music you're listening to or the social media stuff that you follow, it is just like I can't I just can't relate. I just like I don't even know what to offer into this conversation that would be helpful, productive, or would strengthen a connection between us because I don't have the same interests, I don't have the same perspective, I don't have, and so although they were incredibly lovely and like kind-hearted human beings and would have been and were very accepting of me, it just felt like that genuine connection inherently wasn't formed. um and so I wrote about that, but that being said, I was able to find really incredible friends who I'm still friends with to this day.
I think sometimes that could be harder, right? Because you know that the person or people are not trying to be malicious, but it's not in their frame of reference. Or, sometimes it would be beautiful to like talk about your favorite music and exchange playlists, for example. But again, not done maliciously, but I think sometimes that exclusion happens just based on people's experiences and not having that diversity kind of injected in, society in general. But talk to me a little bit about how these experiences have shaped your approach to treating patients in psychiatry, because it sounds like that has given you an awareness of the biopsychosocial aspects that really relate to people's presenting concerns.
Absolutely. And you framed it really beautifully. It's interesting because in medicine, psychiatry is one of the rare instances where truly someone's social positioning really significantly impacts what it is that they are presenting with, right? And when we formulate a patient according to the biological, psychological, and social model, it's so integral to recognize how it is that their traumatic experiences, inclusive of racial trauma, can be affecting their presentation. And if you don't count that in, then you're going to be doing a significant disservice to that patient. And so when I was, because I'm on my maternity leave right now, but when I was actively in my residency, I encountered this a lot. And I was one of the few practitioners, I would say, that would actively and, very clearly ask about race in a lot of my clinical encounters, which I can appreciate that some of the other physicians I was working with either didn't know how to go about it, felt uncomfortable with it, wasn't sure about how it tied, back into their clinical presentation. But I was very forthright with it, especially if that person themselves was racialized. And what I had found anecdotally was that there was a significant amount of unaddressed racial trauma that was
Yes.
affecting their depression, their anxiety, even their psychosis. Like it was remarkable. And I wrote about tangentially these experiences because, as we know, we can't write directly about patient encounters. And so I wrote about fictitious patients that were tangentially influenced by some real clinical experiences. And so I just kind of, made up these narratives. And one of the patients that I described in the book, one of the fictitious patients, is a Nigerian man who presents with his